Imagine the stillness of a royal embalming chamber in ancient Thebes, the air heavy with the scent of resin and incense, the torchlight casting long, trembling shadows across walls covered in hieroglyphs of gods and eternity. You are an embalmer, trained since youth in the sacred art of preserving the dead, your hands steady and sure after years of service to the house of the Pharaoh. But today, the task before you is unlike anything you have ever faced. The body on the marble slab is that of the Pharaoh's wife, a woman the people revered as almost divine. Yet the order you've been given is not to prepare her for the afterlife in the usual way, but to alter her in a manner that defies every ritual you have sworn to uphold. The instructions are precise, chilling, and they make your blood run cold. You understand that what you are about to do is not preservation. It is desecration, cloaked in the language of divine necessity. This was not some rare, isolated incident. Across the long arc of Egyptian history from the first unified kingdoms around 3100 BCE to the final days under Cleopatra and Roman conquest, sexual customs and rituals played a role so central, so deeply ingrained, that they were woven into the very survival of the state. We grow up hearing about the glory of Egypt, the golden treasures buried with kings, the perfect symmetry of the pyramids, the serene gaze of statues carved from stone that has endured millennia. Yet these familiar symbols hide something darker. A culture where sexuality was not merely a private matter, but a public duty, a tool of political control, and, at times, a weapon of unimaginable cruelty. Ancient Egyptian theology bound fertility, cosmic order, and political stability into a single, inescapable equation. The pharaoh was not simply a ruler. He was Horus made flesh, a living god whose virility was thought to influence the flooding of the Nile, the yield of the harvest, and the very breath of the people. In such a worldview, private intimacy became a public affair measured, watched, and sanctified by the priesthood. A failed harvest might mean the gods were displeased, and displeasure often required extreme displays of devotion to restore balance. Evidence of these practices still survives, though rarely in the guidebooks. Certain temple reliefs and papyri describe acts too explicit to be shown in public exhibitions. Victorian archaeologists who first uncovered them in the 19th century were horrified, their sensibilities shaped by a society that could not tolerate frank depictions of sexuality, much less ritualized acts involving children or the dead. Many simply destroyed what they found. Others sealed it away in museum basements, labeling them innocuously as miscellaneous pottery or decorative objects. But for the ancient Egyptians, there was no such taboo. To them, sexual energy was cosmic energy, a sacred current that flowed between humans and gods. Each act was imbued with religious meaning. Each climax, a symbolic union with the divine. Positions, rituals, even bodily modifications were catalogued and prescribed. Part of an elaborate spiritual system meant to ensure harmony between the earthly and celestial realms. It was a belief system with no clear line between worship and desire, between sacred duty and personal pleasure. But this merging of worlds came at a terrible cost. Those born into Egypt's elite families could find themselves offered quite literally to the gods. Domestic slaves, often children, could be forced into roles the priests described as holy service, while their masters saw them as property to be used without consequence. When the natural order faltered, when the Nile ran low or famine loomed, the rituals became even more extreme, more desperate. The pharaoh and his court might be called upon to perform public acts of divine union, or sacrifices might be demanded that left physical and spiritual scars. These were not whispered rumors, but recorded practices, etched in stone and inked on papyrus, now scattered across the world in archives and storerooms. And so we return to the embalmer in that dimly lit chamber, hands trembling not from inexperience, but from the knowledge that the sacred and the profane have merged into something monstrous. The pharaoh's command carries the weight of divine authority. To refuse is to invite death or worse, spiritual annihilation. To obey is to betray the gods you serve. Yet in the twisted logic of the court, obedience is devotion. It is this tension, the clash between faith and fear, devotion and desecration, that runs through the heart of ancient Egypt's most unsettling truths. And it is here, in this shadowed intersection, that our story begins. To understand why the pharaoh's command could override even the most sacred funerary laws, we must step into the Egyptian mind, not just their politics, but their cosmos. To them, the universe was not a cold expanse of stars and empty space. It was a living, breathing organism held together by a fragile thread called Ma'at, the divine order. And like any living thing, it could be nourished or starved. In this worldview, sexual energy was not a private indulgence, but a vital force, as essential to the balance of creation as sunlight and water. The act of intimacy was a ritual, a conduit through which human beings could communicate directly with the gods. Every caress could echo the union of deities, every climax a reenactment of the moment when life itself was renewed. The ancient texts do not treat this as metaphor. They believed it was literal cosmic maintenance. The pharaoh's virility was the axis on which Egypt turned. His body was the vessel of divine potency, his seed a symbol of the Nile's flooding. When the river rose high and rich with silt, it was proof of his favor with the gods. When drought or famine struck, the blame did not fall on mere weather, but on the spiritual health of the ruler's intimate life. This belief placed enormous pressure on Egypt's ruling class. Nobles and priests were not exempt. Their own sexual lives were expected to mirror divine perfection, to serve as miniature models of the pharaoh's cosmic role. Records from certain temple archives, ones rarely shown to the public, hint at elaborate ceremonies in which priests and priestesses engaged in ritual intimacy before sacred statues, their actions believed to feed the gods themselves. But this intertwining of the sacred and the erotic had a darker edge. Those of royal blood were raised knowing that their bodies were public property, instruments for divine work. Children were especially prized, not because of innocence in the modern sense, but because of the belief that their untouched state made them more spiritually potent. In a chilling inversion of morality, the most vulnerable were cast as the most blessed participants in these rites. The temples themselves became theatres for this ideology. Within their massive stone walls, in chambers hidden behind ornate reliefs, rituals took place that blurred the line between worship and exploitation. Musicians played harps and sistrums while dancers swayed in patterns that mirrored celestial movements. Priests recited invocations calling on gods like Hathor, the goddess of love, music, and fertility, to descend into the bodies of the celebrants, granting divine pleasure as a form of blessing. Other cultures of the ancient world had similar concepts. The sacred marriage rites of Mesopotamia, for example, paired kings with priestesses in ceremonies meant to ensure the land's fertility. In Minoan Crete, murals suggest public displays of sexual union tied to religious festivals. Yet in Egypt, the practice was more deeply institutionalized, woven into the very machinery of governance. What made Egypt's system especially dangerous was the absence of boundaries. Because sexual acts were framed as religious necessity, they were shielded from moral scrutiny. There was no crime in fulfilling the gods' desires, and the gods' desires were conveniently interpreted by the priesthood. It was a closed loop, self-justifying and resistant to outside interference. When the Nile ran low or the harvest failed, the logic turned vicious. The gods must be angry. The rituals must not have been potent enough. The solution was always escalation: more participants, more elaborate acts, greater extremes. What began as symbolic offerings could spiral into spectacles of desperation, with the bodies of slaves, captives, and children sacrificed to a cosmic hunger that could never truly be satisfied. We look back now, centuries later, and see the cracks in this divine narrative. We see the human cost, the way religious devotion can be twisted into a mechanism of control. But for the people of the time, it was a truth beyond question. To refuse participation was to defy the gods themselves, and no one, not even a pharaoh, could survive that. In this climate of faith and fear, certain individuals paid the ultimate price for the sake of ritual purity, and none more so than the young boy king whose tomb would, thousands of years later, send a shiver down the spine of the modern world. The year was 1925. Inside a quiet laboratory far from the golden glare of Tutankhamun's famous tomb, Howard Carter's team worked under harsh electric lights, the smell of ancient dust clinging to their clothes. It had been 3 years since they broke into the boy king's burial chamber, and now came the delicate, methodical work of examining his remains. As they unwrapped the brittle linen, each layer revealing a new detail of the 3,000-year-old corpse, they noticed something strange. At first, they thought it might be a trick of the resin or the collapse of fragile tissue over time. But as their scalpels cut away the last shrouds, there was no denying it. Tutankhamun's genitals were missing. Not decayed, not damaged, gone removed with surgical precision. The cut was clean, as if made by a skilled physician. It bore no marks of ancient looters or hurried desecration. Rather, it had all the hallmarks of a deliberate act performed shortly after death, during mummification itself. This alone would have been shocking. But as Carter's contemporaries examined other royal mummies with the benefit of new imaging techniques, a disturbing pattern emerged. Tutankhamun was not unique. Several pharaohs and nobles bore similar signs, some completely castrated, others with modifications that suggested enhancement or the insertion of foreign materials into the genital area. The most chilling case came from the tomb of an unnamed prince of the 18th dynasty. His remains told a story more horrifying than Tutankhamun's. The removal of his genitals had been performed while he was still alive. Analysis of the bone and soft tissue suggested that the mutilation was not an act of punishment, but a religious procedure. In the context of Egyptian belief, such alterations could be seen as preparing the body for a specific role in the afterlife. Ancient funerary texts began to take on a new, sinister clarity. Passages spoke of making the dead more perfect, of shaping their bodies for eternal service to the gods. Others described altering the deceased so they might be acceptable in the divine realm, their physical form modified to fulfill a spiritual function. Some Egyptologists now suspect a link to the Osiris myth. In the most famous telling, Osiris was murdered by his brother Set, who cut his body into pieces and scattered them. When Isis reassembled him, the only part she could not recover was his phallus, which she recreated through magic so that they could conceive the god Horus. For the ancient Egyptians, this myth was not a simple story, it was a cosmic template. To die without genitals, or with them altered, might symbolically align the deceased with Osiris himself, granting them a form of divine rebirth. If these procedures were tied to royal burials, they may have served a dual purpose, marking the deceased as sacred, while also removing their earthly potency, preventing rivals from using their body or their symbolic virility for political purposes. In a society where power and sexuality were inseparable, even a dead ruler's body could be a weapon. Yet the question remains, were these modifications always performed after death? Or were there cases, like the unnamed prince, where the procedure was part of a living ritual? Some scholars believe that certain individuals may have been ritually castrated in life as a form of dedication to the gods, an act of ultimate devotion and submission. We will never know how many such cases there were, because much of the evidence has been destroyed, hidden, or dismissed. The Victorian scholars who first encountered these anomalies were deeply uncomfortable with the implications. Their reports often omitted the details entirely, or disguised them under vague descriptions of damage or incomplete preservation. But for those willing to look closely, the pattern is undeniable, and it forces a chilling conclusion. In ancient Egypt, the boundary between sacred transformation and mutilation was not just thin, it was deliberately erased. In the shadow of Egypt's towering pylons and sprawling courtyards, another, quieter world existed, one that never appeared in the triumphal inscriptions carved into stone. This was the hidden realm of the temple children. To the priests, they were not simply boys and girls. They were living offerings, consecrated from birth or sold into service, destined to serve the gods in ways that would horrify our modern sensibilities. Their training began early, sometimes as young as 6 years old. By the time most children were learning to read basic hieroglyphs or play in the dusty streets, these chosen or condemned were already being shaped into instruments of divine pleasure. The regimen was brutal. Physical conditioning ensured that they could hold poses for hours without trembling, their bodies bent into shapes meant to mimic sacred iconography. They were drilled in rhythms and movements meant to arouse divine favor, taught to use voice and touch as part of elaborate ceremonies. Older acolytes instructed the younger ones in techniques considered essential for maintaining the god's attention during long rituals. Nutrition was deliberately controlled. Certain foods believed to encourage childlike proportions, soft flesh, rounded features were emphasized, while those that might promote early maturation were withheld. This wasn't mere preference. Temple records suggest that some deities were thought to favor bodies that appeared perpetually youthful, equating that form with purity and eternal life. Medical papyri, when stripped of their euphemistic translations, describe the toll of this training. Dislocated joints from forced flexibility exercises, chronic pelvic injuries, respiratory damage from smoke-filled ritual chambers. Infections were common, and so was early death. By some estimates, mortality rates among temple children could reach as high as 70%. The survivors bore other scars, those of the mind. Ancient Egyptian language didn't have the modern vocabulary for trauma, but hints of its effects can be found in surviving personal letters and confessions recorded on ostraka. Adults who had once been temple children often described themselves as empty vessels or shadows of the body. Some threw themselves into religious service with fanatical zeal, unable to imagine a self beyond their role. Others withdrew from society entirely, avoiding marriage or any form of intimate contact. For the ruling elite, this was not abuse, it was cosmic duty. Families of high status sometimes offered their youngest children to the temple in exchange for political favor or divine protection. To refuse the honor was to risk angering both the priesthood and the gods. And if the child in question happened to be a slave, the decision wasn't even theirs to make. The slave markets of Thebes, Memphis, and later Alexandria kept careful records of children trained in sacred arts, who fetched far higher prices than untrained servants. Age, physical appearance, and level of instruction all factored into the transaction, with buyers including both wealthy households and temple officials. In some chilling instances, children were leased for specific festivals, their value determined by how closely their appearance matched the deity being honored. Religious doctrines sanctified the entire system. Priests taught that the children's bodies were not their own, but belonged to the gods. Their role was likened to that of the sacred lotus, beautiful, pure, and fleeting, destined to bloom only briefly before returning to the divine waters. The rhetoric was poetic, even tender, but its reality was ruthless. We must remember, this was a civilization capable of extraordinary compassion and artistry, of literature that spoke of love and devotion with heartbreaking beauty. And yet, within the same society, the sacred could be twisted into justification for cruelty so systematic that it endured for centuries without serious challenge. For these children, the temple was both prison and destiny. And for some, the moment of greatest terror came not during the years of training, but during the festivals when their carefully cultivated skills were displayed before the eyes of a drunken, frenzied populace. Festivals like one in particular, the Feast of Drunkenness. It began with a story, a myth told under the blazing Egyptian sun about the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, who once set out to destroy humankind. The gods, fearing she would succeed, tricked her by flooding the fields with beer dyed red with ochre. Believing it to be blood, Sekhmet drank until her rage dissolved, and she transformed into Hathor, the gentler goddess of love, music, and fertility. From this legend, the Feast of Drunkenness was born. What started as a symbolic commemoration of divine mercy evolved over centuries into something far more chaotic and infinitely darker. Preparations began months before the festival. Temple breweries worked day and night, producing vast vats of beer, often infused with blue lotus, a psychoactive plant known to induce euphoria and mild hallucinations. Other botanicals, some of which modern botanists identify as potent intoxicants, were added to enhance the divine experience. This was not mere celebration, it was chemical engineering for mass ecstasy. When the festival began, the boundaries that governed everyday life dissolved. Masters and slaves drank side by side. Nobles abandoned their marble halls to join the crowds in dusty courtyards, where music and chanting pulsed like a living heartbeat through the city. The intoxicants flowed until inhibitions collapsed, and the crowd, tens of thousands strong, moved as one body, bound together in a state the Egyptians called divine possession. In this altered state, participants believed they were no longer themselves, but vessels for the gods. This conviction stripped away every restraint. Acts that would be punishable by death at any other time became sacred offerings during the feast. Couples engaged in open intimacy in the streets, surrounded by cheering onlookers. Strangers pulled each other into doorways or temple chambers without hesitation. Children were not spared from the spectacle. Ancient accounts and foreign observers record scenes where minors, already prepared through temple training, were paraded as living embodiments of youthful deities. The crowd viewed their participation not as exploitation, but as holy service, a direct channel for divine pleasure. But the festival was not just about sex, it was about violence too. The same frenzy that fueled desire also unleashed aggression. Groups of intoxicated celebrants roamed the city, forcing others to join their rites, sometimes dragging them from their homes. Claw marks, bites, and ritual cuts were left as blessings on those who endured the encounters. Some victims died from internal injuries or were trampled beneath surging crowds. The violence was not random. It followed a grim theological logic. Pain, like pleasure, was an offering. The gods were thought to feed on extremes of human sensation, and the feast of drunkenness was their feast as much as it was the people's. Foreign envoys from Mesopotamia and the Levant often timed their visits to avoid the festival, warning their rulers of the barbaric week when Egypt abandoned all order. One diplomat described the event as a kingdom undone and remade in 7 nights. For the Egyptians, that was exactly the point. The feast served as a kind of cosmic reset. For most of the year, Egypt was a rigidly hierarchical society, where social mobility was almost impossible and divine authority rested in the hands of a few. The festival inverted that order. Slaves could mock their masters, women could abandon husbands without consequence, and priests, those eternal guardians of the sacred, joined the revelry without fear of blasphemy. Yet even in chaos, there was control. The priesthood orchestrated the festival's timing and managed its resources, ensuring that this explosion of anarchy happened within predictable bounds. In their eyes, this was not social collapse but maintenance, a way to vent the pressures of everyday life so that, when the beer ran out and the music faded, the people would return willingly to their chains. The feast of drunkenness was ecstasy and terror bound together. It was freedom and slavery wrapped in the same ritual, and as the centuries passed, it became a cornerstone of Egyptian religious identity, a tradition so deeply rooted that even foreign conquerors found it almost impossible to stamp out. But the question remains, how could a society survive such sanctioned chaos year after year? The answer lies in the cold precision of its design, a precision that turned madness into a tool of statecraft. From the outside, the Feast of Drunkenness might look like the unraveling of Egyptian society, a week-long descent into madness where law, morality, and order was swallowed by the flood of beer and Blue Lotus. But to the priesthood and the pharaoh's court, it was something far more calculated. Chaos was not the enemy. It was the instrument. Egyptian political theology thrived on balance, the constant interplay between Ma'at, order, and Isfet, chaos. To maintain order indefinitely was impossible. To allow chaos without control was suicide. The Feast of Drunkenness became the perfect solution. A ritualized rupture, a controlled implosion of society that released pressure before it could build into real rebellion. During these 7 days, the people could break the rules, mock their rulers, and indulge in the most forbidden pleasures. Slaves could sit in judgment over masters, and even the pharaoh himself might participate in acts that blurred the boundaries of dignity. But when the festival ended, those same slaves would return to servitude. Those same commoners would bow again before the king, and the machinery of the state would grind on as if nothing had happened. Archaeological evidence reinforces the calculated nature of this anarchy. Excavations at temple complexes in Dendera and Edfu have revealed purpose. Built chambers, long, narrow rooms with walls carved smooth, drains in the floor, and niches for oil lamps. Some are decorated with faintly preserved scenes of group rites, their figures half erased either by time or deliberate defacement. The dimensions suggest spaces designed for close-quarters ritual acts, whether ecstatic or violent. The distinction seems to have mattered little. These spaces weren't tucked away as secrets. They were part of the temple's architectural plan, much like storage rooms for grain or workshops for incense. This integration of the sacred and the profane reveals how normalized the extremes of the festival had become. There is also evidence of economic planning. Tablets and papyri record the rationing of beer and bread, the import of special herbs and resins, and even payments to performers and musicians who would guide the festival's energy. The chaos was rehearsed, curated, and funded. It wasn't just tolerated, it was budgeted for. From a psychological perspective, the festival likely reinforced the people's dependence on the system. For a brief time, they experienced a taste of unrestrained power and indulgence. But because it was given to them by the same authorities who normally restricted them, it deepened the illusion that the priesthood and the pharaoh were the ultimate arbiters of freedom. You did not rebel against the hand that allowed you to sin in the name of the gods. And there was another, subtler benefit for the state. The festival exposed dissenters. In the haze of intoxication, hidden grudges could spill into the open. Rivalries became visible, subversive whispers grew louder, and the priesthood could watch, remember, and later act. The feast was not just a release valve, it was an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as divine chaos. Yet, as foreign influence began to creep into Egypt during the later dynasties, this delicate balance between ecstasy and control began to fray. The feast's unrestrained nature clashed with the sensibilities of Greek and, later, Roman rulers, whose own religious rites, though capable of excess, rarely matched Egypt's scale of sanctioned disorder. But before its decline, the feast had already achieved its purpose for over 1,000 years. It kept the people bound in a cycle of repression and release, devotion and indulgence, fear and pleasure. It was proof that the most effective control doesn't always come from chains. It comes from rituals that teach you to love them. And when that ritual was threatened, Egypt itself would begin to unravel. By the time the Ptolemaic dynasty took hold in Egypt, the Feast of Drunkenness and the wider system of sacred sexuality had already lasted for more than a millennium. It was no fringe custom, it was part of Egypt's identity, stitched into the fabric of its religious and political life. But the Greeks who now ruled from Alexandria brought with them a worldview that both admired and recoiled from what they found. The Ptolemies understood they could not simply erase the rituals without risking rebellion. The Egyptian priesthood was powerful, and the people's devotion to their gods ran deep. Yet the new rulers, steeped in Hellenistic ideals of moderation, philosophy, and civic order, could not stomach the extremes of Egypt's sacred chaos. Cleopatra I, faced with mounting criticism from Greek advisors, attempted to reform the feast. She shortened its duration from a week to 3 days, banned certain public acts, and restricted the participation of children in the open streets. It was, in her mind, a compromise, a way to preserve the divine tradition while tempering its excesses. But to the priests, these reforms were an affront to the gods. When famine struck a few years later, they seized on it as proof of divine anger. Natural disasters, military defeats, and economic troubles were all framed as the gods' punishment for diluting sacred rites. Popular unrest swelled, with whispers that the dynasty had lost the sacred order that justified their rule. Cleopatra III would later try her own form of compromise. Publicly, She presented modest, Roman-friendly ceremonies for foreign observers, while privately hosting full-scale versions of the feast for Egypt's religious elite behind closed temple doors. The result was not harmony, but hypocrisy. The secrecy only fueled rumors, and those rumors reached Rome. To the Romans, who valued discipline and saw religion as a tool for state stability, Egypt's sacred sexuality was proof of moral decay. When Augustus Caesar finally conquered Egypt in 30 BCE, he moved quickly to dismantle the system. Priests who resisted were executed. Temple walls bearing explicit carvings were stripped or plastered over. Papyrus scrolls describing ritual acts were burned en masse. Chambers used for sacred intimacy were sealed or destroyed. But the physical destruction was only part of the conquest. The Romans also worked to erase the memory of the rituals. Egyptian children who had been raised in the temple system were suddenly cast adrift, their training now a mark of shame. Many could not adapt to the new order. Roman records speak of suicides, of young men and women wandering the streets of Alexandria as beggars, their identities stripped away along with their sacred roles. Others retreated underground, forming secret cults that tried to keep the old ways alive. These gatherings were dangerous not only for their members who risked execution if discovered, but for the fragile peace of Roman Egypt. Roman governors reported periodic crackdowns on obscene rites, child trafficking networks, and clandestine ceremonies conducted under the guise of other festivals. Still, the memory of Egypt's sacred sexuality proved hard to kill. The trauma of its sudden suppression left deep scars, shaping attitudes toward intimacy and religion for generations. In some ways, the culture never recovered. What had once been a unified vision of cosmic order became a fragmented patchwork of shame, secrecy, and nostalgia. But while the Romans could destroy temples and burn scrolls, they could not stop the most dangerous preservation of all, the one that lay buried beneath the sands, waiting for a new age of discovery. It would be another 1,800 years before that sand would be disturbed, and when it was, the shockwaves would ripple through the very discipline of archaeology itself. When the 19th century dawned, and European explorers began to dig into Egypt's tombs and temples, they expected to find treasures, mummies, and hieroglyphs that confirmed the glory they had read about in classical histories. What they did not expect or could not accept were the things the ancients had chosen to carve into stone with equal pride. Scenes of unrestrained sexuality, ritualized abuse, and the mingling of sacred symbols with explicit acts. The first reaction was shock. The second was concealment. In 1817, the Italian explorer Giovanni Belzoni uncovered a tomb whose walls were covered in vividly painted sexual imagery. Instead of documenting it, he ordered it plastered over, erasing it from view. In his official report, he wrote only of fine religious scenes, never mentioning what had truly been there. This became the standard procedure. The founder of Egypt's Antiquities Service, Auguste Mariette, maintained a private collection of explicit artifacts items he refused to display publicly. In Cairo's Egyptian Museum, entire categories of artifacts were placed in special storage rooms, accessible only to select male scholars. Victorian translators, unwilling to soil the reputation of their discipline, replaced sexual references in ancient texts with vague euphemisms like ritual acts or festive games. The destruction was not limited to language. Flinders Petrie, one of the most famous archaeologists of his time, openly admitted to destroying papyri and statues he deemed obscene. Museums, universities, and academic journals cooperated in a quiet agreement. The sexual history of Egypt was not to be part of the public story. Even in the 20th century, the suppression continued. Medical papyri with sections on sexual health and practices were partially translated or not at all until the 1972nd. The British Museum still keeps thousands of Egyptian artifacts labelled under misleading categories, while the Louvre was caught as recently as 2019, hiding newly discovered papyri from public view. To this day, most documentaries, exhibitions, and school curricula present a sanitized Egypt, one of gold and granite, not flesh and ritual. But beneath that polished surface lies a truth too complex, too human, and too disturbing to be ignored. Because history is not made only of triumphs. It is also made of the things people are desperate to forget. And when we hide those truths, we risk repeating the mistakes they conceal. If you've stayed with me through this journey into Egypt's forbidden past, you now know the side of history the textbooks never taught you, the side that even archaeologists tried to erase. And this is only one chapter in a much larger story of how power, faith, and desire have shaped our world in ways we rarely admit. If you're ready to dig deeper into history's most unsettling secrets, the next story is waiting for you. Click on the video appearing on your screen right now to uncover another hidden chapter 1 that will make even this tale feel tame. And if you found this exploration as gripping as I did, make sure you subscribe so we can keep peeling back the layers of the past together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard. Until next time, stay curious. And never stop questioning the history you think you know.